I think we can start. Welcome panelists and audience to this live webinar as part of the World AMR Awareness Week. My name is Martijn van Gerven, Research Coordinator on AMR at the Access to Medicine Foundation. And I'm very excited that we're part of this buzzing week to create awareness on the issue of drug-resistant infections. So today we're here to discuss how we can move forward in ensuring that antibiotics are manufactured responsibly and that any antibiotic waste generated during the manufacturing does not add to the problem of AMR. And this webinar builds on a recent report published by the Access to Medicine Foundation last August, which sets out clear steps that pharmaceutical companies can take to limit AMR by manufacturing responsibly. So I'm very happy to be joined by three esteemed panelists. So to start off, we have Jennifer Wright, Head of Environment and Sustainability at Pfizer. So I'm very interested to hear your perspective from an industry side. Then we have Kate Medlicott, Team Leader Sanitation and Wastewater at the World Health Organization, or WHO. And last but not least, Abigail Herron, Global Head of ESG and Strategic Partnerships at Aviva Investors. So a nice dynamic group, and thank you all for taking the time to share your expertise with us. And I also want to flag that if audience members have any questions for the panelists, please share them in the chat, because at the end of the session, we will reserve some time to answer any questions from the audience. But before the panel will walk us through the solutions and the developments in driving action within their work, I think it's good to, as a starting point, shortly introduce the topic. It is Awareness Week after all, and address what pharmaceutical companies can do in curbing AMR. So what's the issue that we're talking about today? We really talk about antibiotic waste. So antibiotic waste, this is generated when antibiotics are manufactured, and companies generate this waste, and this is typically released into the environment, and most of the time that's rivers. And if this wastewater contains high concentrations of antibiotics, it can drive resistance in bacteria that are already present in the environment, but it also can hurt and harm the environment itself. And I think what we really want to avoid in this situation is that bacteria are meeting antibiotics. So I think that's kind of the end goal we're looking for here. And what makes this topic so important, I think, to bring awareness to this week is that it touches upon different aspects of the concept of One Health. And it's also a good way to prevent AMR. Because, for example, if you use antibiotics, it also drives AMR, but at least it serves a really good purpose because we're treating infections that can be deadly. While the release of antibiotic waste into the environment or environmental pollution doesn't really serve a purpose. So we can talk today about solutions on how to avoid that. And without being too much of a messenger of bad news, I do want to emphasize that it's a good thing that we can avoid this risk, and we can even consider it as low-hanging fruit to prevent AMR. So where are we currently? I think over the last 6 to 7 years, a lot of progress has been made by pharma companies. And I think it's good to realize that all this progress has been based on voluntary action. So currently there's no regulation on how much antibiotic waste can be released into the river. And in the meantime, the industry, the AMR Industry Alliance, has published the antibiotic manufacturing standard, which provides guidance and serves as a self-assessment tool for companies to comply with discharge limits in the receiving environment. And besides the progress that we've seen from companies, we still highlighted 3 key areas where companies can progress on. So these were highlighted in the report that was published last August, and I quickly want to go through them. So first of all, companies need to implement effective wastewater management methods to ensure that the concentration of antibiotics in wastewater does not trigger resistance. And to give an example, at the moment, it's common practice for companies to assess whether the concentrations of antibiotics is safe in the river after this is released into the river. So a result of that is that strong dilution occurs. And something that companies could do is to ensure that the concentration of antibiotics in wastewater that leaves the factory already complies with safe discharge limits, because this is basically the place where bacteria and antibiotics are first meeting. So it's good to target that. A second action that companies can really move on is using their unique positions in the antibiotic supply chain. So a lot of antibiotics are supplied by smaller companies, and I think the big pharmaceutical companies definitely have a role to play to ensure that the suppliers of active ingredients also manufacture responsibly. And third and last, companies can really publicly disclose how they are managing antibiotic waste. So the disclosure of how much and where antibiotic waste is released into the environment is key to understand where these AMR risks are located. So these are 3 key areas for further action. But without further ado, let's hear from the panelists to hear more on how their work is helping to prevent this issue. And I do want to start with Jennifer. You work for Pfizer, and I think Pfizer has many suppliers, and it demonstrated that achieving compliance with discharge limits in the receiving environment is possible with suppliers. So I think it's a good example for other companies as well. And I'm curious if you could tell us a bit more about the journey on reaching this compliance and the changes you implemented and your experiences and challenges working with those suppliers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. Martin, thank you so much for inviting Pfizer to join in this discussion. So let me start by saying that, we're a healthcare company, and as such, Pfizer is committed to using the power of science, right, to improve people's lives. As you mentioned, with the medicines on the market, it informs everything we do, guides our environmental priorities, including responsible management of wastewater from our operations, which is what we're talking about today. So, our sites operate in compliance with regulations and environmental permit conditions, and we expect the same of our suppliers. That's a given. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, API is not typically included in such regulations and permits. But, we've made it a priority to be an active participant in the development of voluntary frameworks to help address the potential risks from API in the environment. So our approach is to limit discharge of API, including antibiotics, to wastewater from our processes using both environmental risk assessment methodologies combined with emissions control practices and technologies. And because this is such an important issue for us, we've played a significant role in developing the standard that you mentioned, the EMRIA Responsible Manufacturing Standard, as well as the independent third-party certification program, which was just launched this summer, where antibiotics can be certified against the standard. So this is a key element of responsible action, and so we were one of the first companies to pilot that certification program, and we're working on a strategy right now to certify our antibiotics. So, as far as our approach, we've been doing environmental risk assessment of API for a long time, but following the sign-on to the Davos Declaration back in 2016, I think we increased our focus on antibiotic discharges from our sites and our supplier sites. And after Davos, we helped form the EMRIA Manufacturing Committee, which developed the first framework for responsible antibiotic manufacturing, and which was the precursor for the standard. We also work with the EMRIA Science Committee to develop the published predicted no effect concentrations, or PNECs, which are defined in the standard for commonly used antibiotics, and we compare those to the environmental concentrations, or the PECs, for each antibiotic. And this is really considered to be, the scientifically rigorous method for assessing environmental impact that's described in the standard. And it's important to note, I think that the AMR Science Committee, which by the way, Pfizer just recently began chairing, routinely monitors the evolving science in this area, and they will continue to update AMR's approach and the standard on how to do effective risk assessments over time. So as I said earlier, our strategy for wastewater discharge management is aligned with the process in the standard, and that's to say that we implement the published PNECs, and for anything that we don't have, we apply a consistent methodology using available tox data or the industry-derived default PNEC values in a few cases where data are not available. And then we work directly with our sites to calculate the expected concentration in the receiving body for each antibiotic using a mass balance approach. And then we're able to determine the risk quotient or the RQ value. And as you know from reading the standard, the RQ value target is less than 1, which is considered to be an effective indicator of control. So for Pfizer, those sites that we found to be RQ less than 1, we continue to implement the practices that are in the standard through our environmental management system, and then we sort of monitor performance over time. For sites that were found to be RQ greater than 1, we developed mitigation plans with the leaders of those sites, and we are following sort of the hierarchy of controls that's described in the standard to reduce discharges. So first we look at, can we reduce losses by increasing yield in our processes? Second, we look at whether we can segregate and collect wastewater at the point of generation for treatment, especially things like first rinses. And then 3, we invest in and enhance existing wastewater treatment systems for discharges that, we can't otherwise manage. So that's kind of the approach. And because this is such an important issue, Pfizer did publicly commit to meet PNECs for all antibiotics being manufactured at both our internal sites and our supplier sites by 2025. We report this progress out each year in our ESG report. And as you know, Pfizer participates in the AMR benchmark together with other peer companies. So thank you.
Thank you for your valuable insights. Maybe a quick follow-up question on the supplier side. I can imagine you run into challenges to ensure that suppliers are also compliant with discharge limits. What approach do you use to engage with suppliers, and what challenges are there?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously with any technical issue like we're talking about today, there can be challenges, especially because we work with a wide variety of suppliers all around the world with varying levels of maturity related to pharmaceuticals and the environment or PI. So we take a few different tactics. So one way we address these challenges is through our work with the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, or PSCI. So some of our folks on the line may have heard of PSCI. So this is a public industry group that works to educate and equip pharma suppliers with knowledge they need to help address environmental and other supply chain issues. And it serves for the basis of these diligence assessments that we do. But they also reference PI in their core principles, and they include antibiotics in their audit framework. So suppliers hear about this through PSCI. To specifically address AMR risks, we ask our antibiotic suppliers to take the exact same approach that we take at our internal sites and apply the science-based approach that's outlined in the standard, which means we expect them to implement an effective environmental management system and to meet the PNECs and achieve RQ less than 1. And as I just mentioned, we've set a target for them for 2025, just like we set for ourselves. So through active engagement directly with our suppliers, we do offer guidance and support when they need it. So we can help them do a robust risk assessment and develop the appropriate mitigation plans if they're not meeting RQ less than 1. It's really a partnership, right, to advance our collective environmental ambitions. And as you can imagine, the suppliers are moving in and out of our network over time. So this kind of engagement is ongoing, all the time. I'd say from our experience, some challenges could be related to a supplier's ability to provide customer-specific data for environmental risk assessment. Some may be technical challenges related to waste segregation and treatment. But in each case, we work together to develop a strategy to get to RQ less than 1. And the last thing I'll mention is that we have written expectations for doing PI risk assessments and for achieving RQ less than 1 into our supplier agreements for new agreements going forward, and anytime we update agreements. And we've asked that they implement improvement plans if they're not meeting the RQ less than 1 threshold. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting to hear that on one side it's a partnership working together, but you're also able to put it into agreements. So a good example of working together with with your suppliers. So thank you for your insights. Maybe to Kate, I already mentioned there's no regulation or independent standard that stipulates how pharma companies can limit the risk of AMR. So companies are now acting on a voluntary basis. I was wondering, because I did hear that the WHO is developing a guidance document, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about this guidance document. How did this came about? What's the goal? Who's going to use it? Anything that could be relevant for this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Well, firstly, it's great to be here, and just to, I'm the Sanitation and Waste Team Lead at WHO and the focal point for AMR and environment. And I think many of you listening will know this has been a long time coming, since the publication of the Global Action Plan in 2015. Environmental dimensions of AMR were in there, and they've been growing more and more. And certainly there's some desire to have an aspect relating to pharmaceutical pollution. But also just to say this is, one element of a broader strategy on multiple sources of AMR in the environment, whether that's from wastewater treatment plants, from communities, or from agriculture, or from healthcare facilities. So we're not, in this particular effort, we're not sort of picking on manufacturers, but really just one part of a comprehensive strategy. And many of what you will know as well, that the demand has been growing through the G20, numerous reports, academic literature, and so forth. And historically, there's been some efforts to include environmental dimensions within WHO, say through the Good Manufacturing Practices scheme, for example, but it's been sort of somewhat lacking the scientific underpinning. So what we've started doing this year is working on this scientific guidance document, and like many WHO guidance documents, this is non-binding, but it's to be intended to be taken up by a number of different target audiences that do have the ability to require and regulate these things. So in terms of those target audiences, that is of course the manufacturers themselves, also national environmental regulators at the national or regional level. Again, regulatory bodies responsible for the supervision of pharmaceutical products, procurers of antibiotics, generic substitution schemes, and third-party inspection schemes and auditors. So we would anticipate that once this guidance is published, each of those entities will look at it and see how it can be taken up as a foundational scientific guidance to inform their various kinds of regulatory activities. In terms of the scope, so it's covering, we take a One Health approach, and on this and other things, we work with our quadripartite partners. So that's especially UNEP, but also FAO and the World Organization for Animal Health. So the One Health approach would incorporate human health and ecotox targets. It looks at antibiotics used as therapeutic agents for humans, animals, and plants. Includes APIs as well as intermediary products, and covers all steps of the chain. We're looking at both liquid and solid emissions and the release of resistant bacteria. It has a focus on antimicrobials because that's where the evidence is strongest. But perhaps in future ones we could look at other antimicrobial agents as well. In terms of the content, there'll be a version out for public consultation, hopefully by the end of this year. And so you'll get an opportunity to review it in detail then. But what I can say for now is, of course, include many of the things actually that Jennifer described. So, targets expressed as PNEX or technology performance targets, combined with a risk management process to guide manufacturers on the process management things that they can be doing to ensure that those targets are met, and a third-party verification element. And I mean, I think we're of course very sensitive to the issues of access to medicines, and so built into the approach is the concept of progressive improvement, which is within all of WHO guidelines related to any kind of water quality. So yeah, next steps is a public consultation, hopefully by the end of the year, and then of course we will be guided by our expert group and the feedback from that consultation, working to finalise the document next year. So yeah, that's where we're at. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that will be interesting to follow those developments more closely, and maybe also interesting for the audience that there is a public consultation at the end of the year, hopefully online. So yeah, maybe this tool could also be used by investors. And Abigail, we're very happy to have you here, and because investors are starting to pay attention to this issue as well as part of their ESG considerations. I wonder, why should investors care about this topic, and how can you as an investor move the needle with companies? How do you engage with those? Floor is yours.
Thanks, Martijn. Great to be here, and great questions. Yes, you're right. Investors are starting to become more aware and interested in the topic of AMR. I'll qualify that, and it's from a low base. The awareness and action on AMR isn't comparable to a more established topic such as climate change or biodiversity loss in the investment world. But as we know, it's got just as systemic an impact, and it's just as much as a market failure as climate or biodiversity loss. And equally, there's a very strong case for it being both an E and an S topic. I think a lot of investors are kind of catching up on the pertinence of AMR. I mean, I had no idea how important it was. I remember being sat at my desk on a summer's day back in 2015, and our head of equities bounced over to my desk and said, "Oh, Abigail, I watched this BBC Panorama documentary last night, and it's exactly the sort of thing that you would like. You should definitely watch it." And it was called Antibiotic Apocalypse. And before I watched that, I ignorantly thought, AMR was caused by doctors handing out antibiotics like sweets. I didn't really understand, the ground zero was kind of the use in livestock. I didn't understand the supply issues and just the broken economics around the topic. So that was my light bulb moment. And then a few months later, we hosted the first ever AMR conference for investors. It was buy side, it was sell side. We had Lord Jim O'Neill as our keynote, who had just put out the infamous report onto the UK government's report into the economics of AMR. And it was standing room only. I was worried no one would come because it was such an out there topic, but they did come. And so that's always pleasing, isn't it? And so we've been really active on it ever since, and trying to bring more investors into the party. Last week, we had the first ever in-person meeting of something called the Investor Action on AMR. So we had Dame Sally Davis as our as our keynote. She was the previous Chief Medical Officer for England, and she's now the UK government's Chief Envoy on AMR. And I'm sure many of you have heard her speak, but she absolutely lights up the room. She is super inspiring, and she did exactly what she intended to by inspiring action and engagement on the topic in the room with the investors. We've got 16 members of the Investor Action on AMR, and one of the aims of the event last week was to get more investors involved. So we sort of showcased the tools available, because ESG fatigue, it's a real thing. You know, you're being pulled in all sorts of directions on palm oil and diversity and, you know, carbon pricing. There's a million different ways to spend your day. People working in ESG investing are not bored. So the whole point was to get them fired up on AMR, to showcase the tools available to them, to make it easy. You know, exactly like the report that's catalyzed today's webinar has done. You know, it's taken responsible manufacturing, it's broken it down into its component parts and made it nice and digestible. You know, the AMR index as well, that investors love an index, right? So that went down really well. And so that was the investor action on AMR group. And we launched it in Davos in 2020, and it was meant to last for a year. And it was the UK Department of Health and Social Care Fair and the Access to Medicine Index. We were founding members. It's currently ramping up activity, and it's not just a one-year project, it's now a 5-year project, because, you know, 2020 didn't quite go to plan for anyone, did it? So, you know, I think there's now a critical mass of work that investors can draw upon to quickly get up to speed on AMR. You know, a couple of hours on the Access to Medicine Foundation website, you know, you have a really solid understanding. You know, looking at FAIR, looking at the Investor Action on AMR website. And there's also a really good sell side report. Anita McBain from Citi wrote what I think is like the sell side Bible to AMR. It's everything, including responsible manufacturing. And then, I mean, I suppose you're just thinking about your second question. You asked, well, why should investors care about this? And that was the topic of my dissertation. So Aviva kindly paid for me to do a master's on basically why should an investor care about AMR, and if they do care, what's the most impactful thing they can do. So I did that a few years ago on maternity leave, which, you know, as an aside, is a completely bonkers idea to do. If anyone comes up to you and says, I'm thinking of doing a master's on maternity leave, it's ludicrous. Just shake them and tell them it's a bad idea. Anyway, I got through it, and it kind of built out that idea of, you know, an investor guide to AMR 101, and it pulled in things like the macroeconomic implications. There's all sorts of enormous figures that's really hard to get your head around, like the cost to the economy being 100 trillion by 2050, which wiped off global growth, which is more than the whole global economy put together. You know, thinking about the human cost, if we fail to find antibiotics and treat them with the respect that they deserve and manufacture them carefully, then 10 million people a year across the world stand to die by 2050, and that would make antibiotic resistance the world's single biggest killer. And then there's the kind of the portfolio implication. You know, most investors have significant exposure to the 3 sectors at the center of AMR, pharma and biotech, food producers and food retailers. And then you've also got the implications for health and life insurance as well. Maybe your parent company offers that, or maybe you invest in that, or both. So AMR is this market failure, and I think that's what speaks to investors. But there's also the personal angle as well. You know, every investor knows somebody who has had chemotherapy or a C-section or just these medical interventions that we take for granted, but that are potentially off the table if we haven't got our humble antibiotics to depend upon. And then I suppose zooming into responsible manufacturing, I think that's where you know, the Access to Medicine Foundation's report really helps, because it's an area where I suppose investors had an inkling that it was an issue, but they weren't quite sure about the perimeters of it. So this is sort of a Bible to guide conversations with investee companies on this, and also with policymakers too, because they're an important part of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good to hear that the tools by the foundation are helpful, and very interesting to hear that investor action can also be another incentive for companies to act. Congratulations on the masters. That's very inspiring. You're the first person who ever told me doing that. So Congratulations. And yeah, you mentioned the parallels between climate change and AMR. I think AMR is a difficult topic to understand, may have a branding issue, and it is even interlinked with climate change. So I think it's very important to, when you speak about AMR, also talk about the climate and vice versa. So thank you all for sharing these valuable insights. I'm happy to see that there are some questions in the chat, but we will save them to later. So don't be discouraged to ask any questions in the chat. We note them down, and hopefully we can go through them at the end of the session. But I want to switch it up a bit, because in line with the company action that we've seen over the years, like Abigail mentioned, investors, but also governments and procurers are increasingly expecting responsible manufacturing practices from companies. And some procurement policies already exist that reward companies who are managing their waste appropriately. But I'm very curious to hear if these market incentives and rewards through procurement are the way to go, or whether this is too small scale to maybe incentivize a company. So maybe Jennifer, is there something that you could add to this question? Because I'm curious to hear from a company perspective how you look at these procurement initiatives.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely feel that market incentives are a preferred route to take to sort of promote environmental stewardship in a competitive landscape. And based on our experience, some health system procurers are already indicating that they'd use certification against the MRIA standard, as a positive differentiator. So that's good news. And the thinking is that, other procurers will probably, hopefully adopt this view as well. And they will sort of reward manufacturers who are good environmental stewards and following the practices in the standard, and getting certified to, minimize the release of these antibiotics. So I think, time will tell. The certification was just launched this past summer, and the standard's been out for a year or two. So we'll need some time to see how it plays out.
Yes, and besides procurement, there's also some countries that are at least flirting with regulation. I think in the EU there is already some developments. And Kate, you already mentioned that the WHO guidance document might also be used for regulating antibiotic waste. I'm curious, is regulation a good solution? It's more of a stick approach. And what should regulators be aware of when considering regulating antibiotic waste?
Yeah, well, I would say regulation is important. It's not the only piece of the puzzle, but it's an important part of it, because through voluntary initiatives or sort of carrot approaches, you tend to bring along the front end, but regulation will apply to everyone. And also that regulation is often needed to build trust in the various constituency groups, because some self-declarations and other things only go so far. But one thing we find, not just for this topic, but generally across the board, is that the good actors tend to welcome regulation, because it levels the playing field and requires their competitors to do the things that they're already doing voluntarily, and perhaps absorbing the cost of doing that. But those things go hand in hand, right? Like regulation, a good regulation will be enabling. And I think sometimes there's a kind of a fear to regulation, because it's maybe perceived as being heavy-handed or impractical or expensive to implement, or unnecessary red tape. So I think we need to get that right balance between regulation being prepared and drafted in a way that's enabling for those that are implementing it, and also kind of understanding from the implementers' side that regulation is a necessary part of making sure we reach everybody, not just a small number of entities that might want to do it for corporate social responsibility reasons and so forth. Another thing that we kind of see is that some countries may wonder what they can do in terms of regulation if they're not a country that's manufacturing. But of course, there's lots that can be done through other forms of procurement and incentives by countries that are not necessarily manufacturers or large manufacturers. And then, within a typical kind of WHO regulatory document, there would be kind of 3 elements. So we've been really clear about what the target we're trying to achieve is, really clear about what the process that's needed to achieve that target, and then what is the kind of verification, third-party verification process. And on that third element, in terms of the verification, I mean, I think we can say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. That includes for antimicrobial agents. So I think we need to make sure that transparency and public transparency is built into any regulatory approach. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you call regulation an enabler rather than an enforcer, maybe, because indeed maybe too strict of regulation can take companies out of the market and actually affect access to antibiotics. So there is a risk there if it's too strict, maybe it affects access. So I like how you say it's more of an enabler to get everyone on the same playing field. I wonder, maybe Jennifer, if you had this experience where you're really depending on 1 or 2 antibiotic suppliers who are left in the market, and if you're still able to engage with those on achieving responsible manufacturing. And I think this kind of touches upon a question in the chat as well, because you may not be able to use a stick approach with agreements, and you're maybe have to work together a bit more. So any comments on that?
Sure. And before I do that, I appreciate what Kate shared. And I would just say that, a company like Pfizer, we look for, compliance. We will be in compliance with whatever comes our way. But we would hope that it's science-based and risk-based when these kinds of regulations are enacted. And I think that goes along with the enabling piece, right? So your question about suppliers, for Pfizer, responsible manufacturing means continuity of supply and responsible manufacturing, right? So we leverage, as I mentioned before, the education and the principles provided through PSCI to engage with our suppliers, so that they're focused on good manufacturing, cleaning practices to reduce losses, et cetera. In addition, we have those contractual expectations. There's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of negotiations influencing those sorts of things. They're hearing the same things from other AMRIA members and other customers. So I think they want to work with us on this, right? But I would say in that context too, we have had a limited number of suppliers who have not been able to conform to our expectations in one way or another. And so following, engagement and through governance, we have made decisions to, work with other suppliers. But this doesn't impact supply, right? So it's that balance, and we really focus on engagement and education.
Yes, thank you. That's a very clear answer, very insightful. And maybe Abigail, you also said that investors they worry about a lot of different things, climate, but maybe also access to medicine. So I'm curious how, from an investor side, you're able to balance and still incentivize companies on these various topics.
I don't think we're there yet, to be honest. I think it's a really important balance to be struck, but I feel like the conversations are only just evolving to capture that delicate balance. I think when you look at the dynamic between AMR generally and biodiversity and climate, that is becoming more established. Lots of investors are wrapping in their AMR work into a climate work stream as sort of bolt on rather than reinventing a whole new work stream. And equally with biodiversity, which is, the most pertinent aspect for thinking about responsible manufacturing and water and sanitation. But I don't feel like those conversations are being had yet. I'd love for us to come together in a year's time and to be saying, yes, because of the responsible manufacturing report, those sort of conversations are much richer, and there's been an evolution of that. But you know, I think we need to be honest and frank about it, and I don't think that we're there yet.
That's at least an honest answer. So hopefully we're able to work towards that. And next year there's of course the high-level meeting on AMR. So curious to see how this topic will be included as well. Maybe we have time to go to a few questions by the audience. So thank you for participating. I have a question specifically to Jennifer, more on the technological side. So feel free to answer the best you can. Like, what are the technologies or systems that Pfizer is using to reduce antibiotic waste in wastewater? Is there anything you could share about that?
Sure, sort of at a high level. Some of the technology goes beyond my expertise, but you know, I think looking at our internal processes or our supplier processes is always the first step. So, you know, how do we minimize losses from the very beginning through the way that we are manufacturing? And so looking at rinses, washes, dry vac versus wet vac, you know, those kinds of things to make sure that, you know, these powders, we're collecting as much as we can at the front end. And then, you know, even collecting and treating is another way, right? If we need to do something like that to help us achieve the target of RQ less than 1. You remember I mentioned that hierarchy of controls in the beginning. So we sort of look at how do we improve our processes to reduce losses? How do we collect and treat if we need to? And then finally, do we need to invest in, you know, enhancing our treatment capabilities at our sites? You know, and some of it, like I said, those technologies are beyond me on the treatment side, but that's sort of the approach following this hierarchy of controls, if that helps.
Yeah, because there was also a question about cost effectiveness, but I think this also partly answers it, that a lot of the gains that are made are not that cost intensive, if I summarize that correctly.
Yeah,
And
I
a
would
lot
say
of
that.
the...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was
It's all
just
you.
going to say, you know, going through that hierarchy of controls, we have the most control and sort of the most cost-effective approaches at the beginning by changing the processes, right? And as you go through that, certainly if you need to invest from a capital perspective, you know, the price tag goes up. So we certainly want to be starting at the beginning and say, how do we limit losses, you know, through our processes right off the bat?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. We got a question specifically on the situation in China and how we could enable and engage with China-based manufacturers. I think maybe Jennifer, you work with suppliers from China, but I'm also maybe interested to hear from other panelists if they have any ideas on how to work with China-based manufacturers, as a lot of the active ingredients are actually manufactured there.
Yeah, I'm happy to give a quickie, and then if anyone else wants to, yeah. So you know, through PSCI, we have very high levels of engagement in China with suppliers in China. So there's a huge effort. We actually have a sub team that's focused just on China. So there's a huge amount of effort going into educating those suppliers around PI, around, you know, environmental risk assessments and implementing the requirements in the standard. So I'll leave it to the others to comment if they.
Yeah, maybe I would just say, you know, China, of course, is one of the big manufacturers and is you know, one of many countries for which this kind of guidance would be relevant. And I think once we get this document out there, we need to be working through all of those channels to target national regulators, procurers, and China's in the mix there, of course, as a key country. So yeah, we'll be working with them in our usual sort of member state engagement forum.
Thank you. Abigail, do you have any experience of working with companies in China?
I was just going to build on what Kate said, and I totally agree. I would just add soft diplomacy and actually going there in person are, I think, the key elements for engaging on issues more broadly with Chinese companies. It's very difficult to start a conversation about something as kind of technical and gnarly as this by post or by email. You need that kind of high level introduction, and then putting the hours in upfront to building those relationships. So it's high reward, but also quite an intensive country to engage in.
Maybe just to add, of course, it's not starting from a low base there at all. So it's excellent science coming out of China on this topic, and I think they're well aware of it, right? So we just need to, continue work that's already moving and maybe add some additional kind of formality to it.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Maybe to close the session already, where I want to give the floor maybe to each of you to have like maybe 1 minute with a key takeaway or a message or solution, maybe directed even at the UN high-level meeting. Be creative as you want to be. Maybe Abigail, to start with you, 1 minute.
Sure, thank you. I guess my lasting thoughts would all be about solutions here. As there's 3 key takeaways. One, the report that's brought us all together today is brilliant. Have a read of it and keep it in your back pocket. It's a key piece of puzzle, a key piece of the puzzle in the whole AMR landscape. Secondly, for investors on the line, have a look at joining investor action on AMR. And I suppose thirdly, don't think of AMR as this separate whole new thing that you need to set up. Just add it into your work on climate change, add it into your work on biodiversity. We wrote this report called Confronting a Permacrisis. I'll put a link in the chat. It's basically how AMR intersects with climate change and biodiversity. So yeah, I think those would be my key 3 actions to encourage everyone to take.
Thank you. Maybe moving to Kate.
Yeah, I didn't have a particularly prepared statement, but as we're thinking, some sort of key takeaways for me is firstly just to recognise this is one element within a very broad suite of actions to try and combat what is a very serious public health threat. One sort of dawning for me, I guess, when you see a lot of the fear around potential for regulation or loss of access is slightly different mindsets in the environmental versus medical communities. I think the medical community is very much guided by do no harm. Environmental management is much more about progressive improvement. So I think none of us should be fearful that this is going to stop access to medicines, but it's going to make sure that that's done in a safer way. And then finally, just to say, a reminder, we are working on this. We have a expert group and a public consultation that we hope to hear from stakeholders to make sure that the document is as useful as possible. I'll stop there, and happy World Antibiotics Awareness Week.
Yeah, thank you. And to squeeze in a question that just came into the chat for you, Kate, can we understand whether the WHO guidance document is going to be focused on good manufacturing practices like GMP side, or the environmental audit approach? Is there anything you could share on that?
It's both. So GMP is one of the target audiences. That's quite a large mechanism in its own right. But I mean, what they've been looking for is scientific guidance to figure out hopefully how they would integrate this into the GMP. So once this is out, they will be having their own processes to evaluate that, as we would also hope national regulators and others would adopt the guidance.
Thank you for that quick answer. Then I have, last but not least, Jennifer to take the floor.
Thanks, Martijn, and thanks to Kate and Abigail. Great talking with you all today. So, as a science-based company and a responsible manufacturer, I think Pfizer and other AMRIA members, right, we're committed to environmental stewardship and using a risk-based, science-based approach to limiting release of antibiotics, which the AMRIA standard, provides clear guidance for manufacturers on how to do this, including our suppliers, on how to implement a good environmental management system, how to apply the PNEX and shoot for the RQ less than 1 target. So, we hope this is widely implemented and taken up. Also getting the, certification through the independent third-party certification process is a great way to help procurers, right, navigate the landscape of medicines out there. So I would say, we're looking forward to see what the WHO guidance is as well, how that, how we can continue to be a science-based company and approach this from the best possible angle. Thanks, Martijn.
Thank you, and thank you all for those call outs. It's been a nice closure of a great discussion in recognition of World AMR Awareness Week. I think it's been an exciting year in manufacturing. We've been really zooming in on this manufacturing topic today, but there's a lot of movement from different parties. So industry is moving by themselves. Investors are engaging with companies. WHO is making a guidance. Procurers are implementing a reward-based criteria on a positive note to reward companies that are doing really well. So there's a lot of movement, and I hope to keep this momentum to the UN high-level meeting next year to see where we are at that point. I also want to clarify that the webinar is recorded, so it can be shared externally or with other people as well. And I think this meeting really shows how much progress has been made over the years and what solutions are out there to do more. So I want to close off with thanking the panelists. Really want to thank you for your expertise and sharing the valuable examples. And I wish you all a really good rest of your day. And thank you to the audience as well.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.